So I've been going over Thomas Carlyle's French Revolution on this channel, and we've gone through the first 2 volumes of 3. We've reached the stage of the September Massacre 1792, before France really becomes a republic, and there is a regicide against Louis XVI. So I wanted to crystallize what we've gotten so far and come up with some rules of revolution that Thomas Carlyle has stated implicitly throughout the narrative so far. So let's get going. This is just going to be a form of crystallization of what really has been discussed in more detail on the individual books, which I've made into individual videos on the channel. Look for Thomas Carlyle's French Revolution playlist. So Thomas Carlyle's Rules of Revolution. Rule 1. The apple still falls. This comes from Carlyle's position that, yes, the apple does not fall far from the tree. Monarchy is still from the same genus. You are the inheritor of blood and birth, that of your father, or in the case of Louis XV to Louis XVI, grandfather to grandson. So the apple doesn't fall far, but it still falls. That being the nature of gravity is for the apple to fall, just as the nature, if left unchecked by any sense of will or determination and power of a new monarch, will be to fall in the eyes of his father and in the eyes of the government that preceded him. In the case of Louis XV to Louis XVI, we had 1774 being the date that Carlyle chose to start the revolution, and so chose to really indict his first rule of how revolution comes to pass. The apple still falls. If you do not catch it, if you do not be something active from the fall, you will lead to the slip and slide of regulation, daily life, function of government. That will eventually lead to revolution. And Carlyle has stated that revolution is merely a change that happens in a rapid nature. So he would not consider a revolution a long march in a Carlylean sense. What we're talking about here is something that genuinely turns into a convulsion. Rule 2. The power of the pen. So, knowing that the apple still falls, that when you change from a regime of Louis XV to Louis XVI, there needs to be an action by the character who is inheriting the monarchy or the throne or the seat of power. There's also a second ingredient that needs to exist for the revolution, and that is a power of the pen. The power of the pen is the power of a Voltaire or a Rousseau, whose thoughts and ideas precede the revolution but permeate the society in the coffee houses and in the growing sense of the advocacy class. This milieu in Paris who deem themselves intellectual, deem themselves enlightened, and the old regime as despotic. How did that come to pass? It's because pamphlets, books were printed, passed through these coffee houses. Ideas were beginning to germinate, and you can really think of the model like that of a spoken wheel, or more like that of a node, serious nodes in a network. Those nodes are people like Voltaire and Rousseau, who, through the power of the pen, have permeated the coffee shop gentry with ideas of change, which then, when picked up in a chattering class or the blabbering class, it can turn itself to a revolution. Again, we need rule number 1 to be established in order for rule number 2 to gain ground. The power of the pen, if the apple still falls, rule didn't hold. If the apple was caught or if through action it stayed close to the tree, then the power of the pen doesn't manifest. Rule 3. Reforming a mess makes it messier. This is one that Carlyle goes on and on about throughout. It's not contained to a particular book. You can think of my first 2 rules as containing to books 1 and 2 of volume 1, in which detail the death of Louis XV and then the paper age, as Carlyle calls it, or Voltaire, the influences of Voltaire and Rousseau. Here it's, okay, we've read Voltaire and Rousseau, and now we don't want a revolution at this point, but we want to just make simple reforms. If you're reforming something messy, for instance, the various parliaments that were in France, you can see here on the right-hand side, the Parliament de Paris was the largest, and the Parliament de Bordeaux, at Toulouse in the south, Parliament d'Aix in the south east, it's a messy affair. What is the genuine power? The jurisdictions, the executive ability of each of these bodies is very muddled. How much power actually lays in Versailles with the king, and what is the real purpose and function of these parliaments? This gives lead to an advocacy class who want to change it and reform it, i.e. insert themselves into a new reformed national parliament, which then takes on the various forms of legislative assembly, national convention, all different names for the same attempt to reform something during the revolution. But really what they're doing in each invocation is making the separation between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary more muddled and more confused than it even existed in this map on the right hand side, which precedes the revolution. So unless you have a very strong, cohesive plan, if you're going to reform something messy, you will make it messier. Rule 4. Symbols have staying power. This is a shot of the Bastille. It's from an artwork in Assassin's Creed, I believe. But I've gone for the Bastille because it's such a symbol of the revolution, and it's the starting point, really, of it. Carlyle waits until book 5 before talking through the events of the Bastille. He wants to give it the prelude, as fittingly I've kind of given a lead into it with my rules of how we get here. But knowing that the first 3 rules have held, there needs to be a symbol of some form of the old regime or ancien regime that can be attacked. What better one than something that's physically a fortress, in the case of the Bastille, which also serves as an underlying practical element to it. It had arms and it had gunpowder. It could arm the people. But really, it's actually more important that it works as a symbol so you can then control the narrative. By seizing the Bastille, by decimating it, it became a symbol that the regime could be attacked. And so when all the 3 previous rules have held, you attack the symbol, such as the Bastille, that's when the revolution kicks into another gear. So symbols have staying power. Think of the fact Bastille Day is still celebrated today. If you attack the symbol, it can long outlive the revolution itself, the fact that that symbolic event occurred. Rule 5. Power of the Pantry. So after the Bastille, there's a little bit of what Carlyle considers consolidation. A period of consolidation, which he talks through in Volume 1, Book 6. In Volume 1, Book 7, however, we have the Women's March on Versailles in October 1789. And that comes about because patriotism was used as a means to suppress the revolution further after the symbolic act of the Bastille had occurred, but hadn't really tampered with underlying fundamental problems such as the Pantry. Patriotism, which is, you can think of it's a heavy guard clubbing down, bashing down in the streets any convulsion that they see, any restlessness by people such as the National Guard or whatever armed forces are in the city to keep the peace at the time. Patriotism doesn't work on the power of the Pantry, which is namely that of women. Women notice the Pantry, according to Carlyle, because they're the ones in the 18th century who were at home and could tell what actual food stocks were like. They had to prepare the food. And so when the pantry is empty, when the economic crisis coupled with a bad winter happens so that there's a genuine hunger pang, this can lead the women into revolt, which you can't put down by patriotism, by the same means that you're putting down the masculine revolt, because although they have pikes and are armed here, to be seen to do so will create another Rule 4, a symbolic event. You cannot be seen to crush the helpless. So the power of the Pantry really is the spreading of a revolution to different classes and different sets of people, which make it harder to control. Because once numerous classes are in revolt, your one method, for instance, patriotism, will no longer work because it's turning into a whack-a-mole. You whack them down and another class will spring up into revolt. Rule 6. Honour a feat with a feast. This is how Carlyle starts off Volume 2 with the Fête de la Fédération, which he calls the Feast of the Pikes. It's a year on from the Bastille in 1790, and we can see on the right-hand side it's Lafayette taking an oath, swearing fealty to the ideals of the revolution as it was in the situation in 1790. What this does is it creates an annual event. It's coupled with Rule 4. Rule 4 is the event which actually happens and turning the Bastille into a symbol. This is the cementing of the symbolization of the event. Defeat is the taking of the Bastille, and then you should couple that with feast. Christianity did the same when it tried to co-opt feasts that existed in pagan antiquity and insert a Christian tale or feat into the feast. So if a revolution is to continue to cement its position in turning over the previous regime, it needs to honor a feat with a feast. Rule 7. Contentment is defeat. Here's another one where we see Lafayette on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side is Mayor Bailly, who is the first revolutionary mayor of Paris, though he is not the most revolutionary mayor of Paris in terms of Carlyle's narrative. He is one who eventually is a constitutional monarchist. Similar sentiments lie in Lafayette. They're content at this point, at Rule 6, and think that it's enough to cement the revolution. But of course, Carlyle's definition of the revolution is change that's happening with rapid speed. They haven't fixed the underlying Rule 5, which is the power of the pantry. Tough winters still occur in the Parisian post-revolutionary scene, and so contentment, i.e. I am content with how far this revolution has gone, is defeat, because the speed and dexterity of the revolution is something that is almost a natural occurring force which you cannot control. The minute you are content with it, you are defeated. Think of the fervent energy that the Jacobins have maintained through the years 1792, late 1792, 1793. They're the ones who are always pushing. They're the ones who are never content with the situation of what was going on with National Assembly turning to Legislative Assembly, or with the Swiss Guard treatment out in the Revolt of Nancy, or what should happen to the priestly class or priestly wealth. And so they're the ones who are never defeated until the revolution has run its entire course, which hopefully we'll be able to add a few rules once we get through Carlyle's Volume 3. But for now, getting to the nadir of the revolution, Rule 7 holds. Contentment is defeat. Rule 8. Kingship abhors a vacuum. Linked to Rule 1, which states that the apple still falls, the idea that there needs to be a king or a roi is still one that's intuitive into all aspects of life, all aspects of society and civilization. If the official king falls, i.e. Louis XVI is seen to still have fallen away from the reign of Louis XV, a new king will arise, even if he himself is not officially styled as such. The stylings and the honorifics are just that. They're gestures and words in Carlyle's mind to associate somebody with a certain regime, but it does not mean that they are a king in the true sense, a leader, one who speaks and the others listen. Carlyle says really that once you have had 1789 into the years of 1790, 1791, the true kingship had passed to this man at the top right, Comte de Mirabeau. He, coming up from Ice in the south, the Parlement d'Ice that you saw in the Messier rule, bottom right here, comes up to Paris to really galvanize the National Convention. He's known as a great orator, speaker, and a swearer of minds. He also has quite an independent streak to him. He ruffles feathers both on the right, who want to go back to the Ancien Regime, and on the left. He would be considered even further right than Lafayette and Mayor Bailly, who we saw here. But he has managed to capture the new institution the best. He is the king of the new advocacy class, which are in the National Assemblies post-revolution. Unfortunately, though, he dies in April 1791, just as he was hoping to cement the power of his kingship through some sort of constitutional monarchist pact with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And what that does means he dies, and his attempt to form his kingdom, so to speak, falls to this man on the left, Jacques Danton, who is a sans-culotte, and becomes the new king in place of Mirabeau. So what we can see here is Rule 8, Kingship abhors a vacuum. If it's not Louis XVI, it will be Mirabeau, and if it's not Mirabeau, it will be Danton. And the more of the churn, in terms of this true kingship ideal you have, the more closer you get towards a revolution, because the rapidity of the change increases. And finally, we have Rule 9, which we see Carlyle talk about in the last few chapters of Volume 2, which is the collapse of the Constitution, that of having a constitutional monarchy. And here we see three characters, Robespierre, Danton in the centre, and Jean-Paul Marat on the right, gesticulating wildly. What is Subterranean is not buried. Subterranean is one of the last chapters he has in his final book, in which he details the Marseillaise, how the Marseillaise storm the Tuileries, where Louis was effectively a prisoner in his own Parisian palace, march him to the National Assembly, or Legislative Assembly as was then called, and basically through force have enacted the end of the French monarchy. For a while, when Lafayette and his ilk were in power, the constitutional monarchs, Feuilletism had held sway, it looked like the Jacobins under the likes of Robespierre were what Carlyle deems subterranean. But subterranean is not buried. It's not something that's finished. It's actually something that can plot in the shadows. It's something that, if Rule 3 holds, reforming a mess makes it messier, can give life to the fact it is subterranean, because it works outside the reforming body, which is only getting messier and messier. Think of the constitution that cannot walk. Making a constitution walk, in Carlyle's sense, is linked to Rule 3. It can plot in the shadows, and it can come up with events such as the August coup and assert itself into power. It's never content. So what is subterranean links with Rule 7, contentment is defeat, and it is not buried because while subterranean is still hatching away, is active, it is simply out of view, and it can spring to life and above ground at any moment. So these are some of the rules I've seen from reading Volume 1 and 2. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope we can look forward to Volume 3 with a bit more of a crystallized idea of what we've gone through so far.